Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second half of today's session. My name is Nina Bow, and I'm on Tanenbaum's Workplace Program team, and I'm delighted to welcome Dan Cox from the Survey Center on American Life to take us through some domestic demographic data and research. With that, I'm happy to hand it over to Dan.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our recent research on a variety of topics, but one of the things where I really want to get into is providing a better understanding of just how dramatically the religious landscape has shifted over the last several decades and the downstream political and cultural impacts that it's having on our society. So a quick note about me and the Survey Center on the American Life is that we are part of the American Enterprise Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research center. We don't take any positions on issues. So our goal is really to inform and educate the public on a whole variety of different things, including religion and politics and culture. Okay, so let's just dive right in. The first thing I want to discuss is looking at the decline of religion in the US. Many of you are going to be familiar with this. It's been covered a lot in the news. Sociologists, scholars of religion have remarked about this trend, and it's, if anything, accelerating. So most people locate the increase of people who identify religiously as nothing or nuns, N-O-N-E-S, or religiously unaffiliated in the early 90s. And these are 3 or 4 different data sources here showing that, again, basically in the early 90s, there's an uptick in people saying, I have no formal identity with any religious tradition. Currently, about 1 in 4 Americans are unaffiliated. That number is as high as 29% in some surveys and as low as 22, 23%. Estimates vary a little bit, but overall, the direction of the change is all in the same way. And one of the things to note is that it's not really a sort of steady pattern. What we're seeing over the last 5, 6, 7 years is that the rate of disaffiliation is actually increasing, something we can talk about a little bit later. It's not just about identity and affiliation, though. One of the things that's really interesting is that we're seeing patterns of religious affiliation, identity, belief, and participation are all equally affected. And this is just looking at patterns of religious attendance. So again, beginning in the 90s, but really accelerating post 2010, we're seeing a decline in people who are attending religious services regularly. This is some Pew data that asks, are you attending monthly or more often? So regular and fairly regular attenders, and people who attend seldom or not at all. And again, that number is climbing. I think one of the enduring myths about the unaffiliated is that it's predominantly young people who've always been unaffiliated, and we're just witnessing the same patterns we have, that we are today over time, right? So that young people are not religious when they're younger, and then as they age, they hit certain life milestones. They buy a house, they get married, sort of settle down in a career. That these kinds of things sort of inexorably lead them back to a religious community. And that's really not the case. That sort of pattern is not, that we sort of saw with baby boomer generation, is not being replicated among millennials and unlikely to be replicated among Gen Z. So this is just the people who are religiously unaffiliated at 4 different time periods in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2021. And one of the starkest patterns is that there is a clear generational pattern, right? In terms of young people are rather more likely to be religiously unaffiliated in each of the 4 time periods. And it sort of stair steps down, right? So as you get older, you're more likely to be religious. As you get younger, you're less likely. But as you can see, the shift in the stair steps is really rather remarkable. In 2021, 43% of young adults were religiously unaffiliated. In 1990, that was only 11%. So 4 times as many people in 2021 as 1990 are unaffiliated. So we're seeing this sort of shift towards non-religious identity increasing among basically every age cohort. So there's no one that's not affected. It's not just happening among young people, and it's not the same pattern we're seeing being replicated again and again. Rather, what we're seeing is something entirely different. Something else that I think is really notable and related to these patterns we're seeing is that the age distribution of various religious groups is significantly different. Some of the oldest religious groups in the country, Jews, white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, white evangelical Protestants, and you'll notice that three of those four groups are white Christians. Again, these are some of the oldest religious groups in the country. And at the other end, we see Muslims, Hindus, and people who are religiously unaffiliated are among the youngest. And that, fast forward and you're looking at how that's going to change generationally as oldest Americans age out and younger Americans age into the population. That's going to carry forward. And those groups that are youngest are going to probably increase in size. But the story about religious change in the US isn't just about decline. I mean, that's certainly a pretty critical one, but it's also about who is leaving. So 2 decades ago, there's a pair of sociologists that looked at and first identified this pattern of religious decline in the US using the General Social Survey. And one of the things they noted was that it's not only that the numbers were increasing, but who was leaving, right? Like most of this change was driven by people leaving their formative or childhood religions. And one of the things they noted is that liberals and political moderates were far more likely to disaffiliate than conservatives. And more recently, what people have argued is that we're not just seeing an overall decline. What we're seeing is sort of a religious polarization, where people who have strong attachments to religion are not really affected by this trend. They remain strongly committed to their faith, to their church, to their place of worship, and that people with weaker attachments to religion, in this case, this measure of not strong affiliation, those are the folks that were most likely to disaffiliate. And so you're seeing this kind of bipolar pattern where you have a large group of really religious folks sort of committed to their faith, and this group of non-religious folks, many of whom have very negative attitudes about religion. And this is a problem, I think, like when you think about downstream impacts on culture and politics that I think is worth paying attention to. I want to talk a little bit about Gen Z. They're just becoming old enough that we can start learning about them in polls. This is, of course, the generation that came after the millennial generation. And the oldest Gen Zers are now about in their mid-20s. And so again, they're starting to appear in our surveys of adults age 18 and up. And we conducted a survey for the Knight Foundation not too long ago, looking at the sort of distinct religious experiences of Gen Z. One of which is that they, compared to even millennials, they're far less religious. They're also a cohort that is more religiously diverse. And one of the things that's really notable, if you look at this chart, one is, again, the 34% of unaffiliated people who are Gen Zers who are unaffiliated is really notable. But the other thing that I think is incredibly important is that Gen Z is living in a sort of an entirely different country than, say, baby boomers or the silent generation in terms of religion. And I think that has a really significant impact on how they think about faith, religion, and religion's role in public life and politics. It's being informed by their cohort, their peers, people who they interact with and engage with and trust. And if you look at changes over the last decade, it's distinct from the millennial generation. When millennials were the same age that Gen Zers were, religious institutions were still largely trusted. If you look at Gallup polling, people had positive views of religious leaders, trusted places of worship, churches, and organized religion generally. And that's no longer true. Just to give you an example, in 2021, Gallup found that only 37% of the public said they trusted organized religion a great deal. When millennials were that same age, in their early 20s, roughly a decade or so ago, that number was a majority. So a majority of the public said that they trusted organized religion, and that has since cratered over the last 10 years. And that, again, that's a very different context to be making choices about religion, to be thinking about engagement in religious communities, and to think about the impressions of religious people if you are not religious. This is probably one of the most important ways that the Generation Z is different from previous generations, is that compared to even millennials, but also Gen X, baby boomers, and the silent generation, they had far weaker attachments to religion growing up. They were less exposed to religious ideas. They were less engaged in religious pursuits and practices. This question just asked about their formative identity. So what was your family growing up? Were you Catholic? Were you Protestant? Were you Jewish, Muslim, Hindu? And 15% of Gen Z said they were never religious. So they are not religious today, and they were not religious growing up. So they have had, ostensibly no experience with religion, and their exposure to it is coming through maybe friends, maybe popular culture, entertainment media, news media. And that's a really different environment in which to make, to gain information about people of faith and religion more broadly. If you look at millennials, yes, they also, a significant number were saying they're they were not raised in religion, but that number keeps creeping up. And I think it's a really important distinction for the Gen Z generation. So I'm just looking at a question. Why are the why? So the question was, why did we divide this along racial categories? So why separate Catholics from white Catholics, Hispanic Catholics, and other Catholics? And the answer to that is that culturally, politically, those differences are really, really important. So most African-American Protestants identify as evangelical, but the culture and the politics of Black evangelical Protestants and white evangelical Protestants could not be more distinct. And we'll see that a little bit later in the presentation. We start getting into some cultural and political attitudes. The groups diverge really, really sharply in ways that are important. So most pollsters that study religion, most sociologists have some way of defining religious groups that also includes race or ethnicity, but it's a great question. Continuing this idea that Gen Z has participated less often in religious services growing up. These are 4 questions that we asked, which is how often did you engage in these various activities growing up? And again, the pattern is pretty clear that compared to other generations, Gen Z was just less religiously active during their childhood. So only 40% said they attended services with their family growing up. Roughly the same number said they attended Sunday school or another type of religious education program. And similarly, about 4 in 10 said they said grace or prayed with their family at meal times. And again, over all these different questions, the pattern is that Gen Z was just less religiously engaged growing up than previous generations. We talked a lot about identity and patterns of behavior, but we also see some distinctions among Gen Z in terms of belief. And here we asked a question about just amount of uncertainty when it comes to belief in God. If you look at questions about belief in God, Gallup has been asking this since the 1940s. And there's, if you ask a binary question, do you believe in God, yes or no, there's been really little change in terms of how people think about God in a binary sense, right? So it's like 8 and 10, according to the most recent poll, maybe down from like 9 and 10 in the 40s when Gallup started asking it. And about the 70s or 80s, what happened is pollsters started asking about certainty and doubt. So to what degree do people have doubts about their belief in God? And now during that time period, we actually started to see, well, people believe in God, but a significant number actually entertain some doubts about the existence of God. And here we see, again, comparatively, Gen Z far more likely to have religious doubts than baby boomers and silent generation, and even then millennials and Gen X. And I think a lot of this also is a reflection of their upbringing, of course, but also the broader cultural context. Americans with more diverse religious networks, so if I have friends or family members who are of different faiths or none at all, they tend to express greater doubts and have sort of more flexible ideas about their views about religion or their theology in response to that, right? So, and we see this at nearly every level, right? So the community level, family level, that again, diverse social contexts seem to induce or encourage people to adopt sort of greater flexibility and sort of less sort of consistent and rigid attitudes when it comes to religion. And I think this is, this to me suggests a central challenge of religious pluralism, right? That if diverse religious contexts, again, whether it's a community or a family or a workplace, is associated with lower levels of religious commitment, which it is, most sociological work shows that it is, including my own. How do you maintain strong commitments in a multicultural society, right? I think like that's sort of the tension there, because exposure to distinct ways of being and practice religion can influence how we think about our own. And there's a very human and I think social tendency to want to downplay areas of difference and disagreement, I think particularly in more intimate settings. And we see this in families, right? So Americans raised in interfaith families tend to display much lower levels of religious commitment, much higher doubts about the sort of benefits of religion. And you see this across, a variety of different cultural contexts. The other thing that's shifting, and again, it is certainly related to these early religious exposures and the context in which Gen Z is growing up, is that Gen Z tends to harbor, if not more negative attitudes about religion, I think some more apathy in terms of the benefits of religion. And so here we ask the question about whether it's necessary to raise children in a religion so they learn good values. Roughly 6 in 10 Gen Zers say it's not necessary. Again, millennials are divided. Gen X and baby boomers and silent generations all affirming that statement. And so this, I think, suggests that for Gen Zers, even those who may retain connection to their family of religious faith or are just religious themselves, the way they might approach it and the sort of centrality of it in their lives may be quite different. And we're already seeing some of that, and I'll get into a little bit later, but at major life events, sort of keystone moments, whether it's births or weddings or even deaths, religion is playing a much more limited role in American life. It's occupying a more peripheral space, or it's absent altogether. The next part I want to talk about is the disappearance of institutional religion. We talked about sort of the personal aspects, participation, belief, identity. And I want to look at a little bit about what happens when people no longer are part of religious communities and some of the downsides of that. So this is based on some Gallup data. They've been, again, collecting data on religion for a long, long time. And over the last roughly 10, 15 years, we've seen a really precipitous decline in religious membership. So are you a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque? This is Gallup's wording. And we see less than half of Americans today said they are members. It's even lower post-pandemic. So this survey was conducted, I think maybe at the early stage of the pandemic, and now we're seeing, I think it's even lower now. And in some respects, that's really societally challenging and concerning. In the US, churches and places of worship have long been an important civic, social, and associational. They've done a lot of that important work. In some ways, it's been unique work that no other institution has been able to really fulfill. They've also performed an incredibly varied number of functions, serving as places of social support, political activism. They've been critical institutions devoted to the health and welfare of not only their members, but the sort of broader society. So the decline of these places with no real alternative in sight, it has a lot of people concerned about just what happens to communities when, one of the few places that was sort of open and working towards these sort of shared communal goals simply disappear. Relatedly, and if you're familiar with Robert Putnam's work in Bowling Alone, others have found similarly that we're witnessing an overall decline of volunteering in the US, lower levels of civic activity, lower levels of associational life, so people aren't members of things as much anymore. Relatedly, in some of our recent work, we found that people's friendship circles, so the number of close friends that they have is also declining pretty dramatically. In the early 90s, most Americans had close friends. The social circles that they had were fairly robust, and that has plummeted over the ensuing few decades, and particularly for men and men without a college degree. And this is showing one of the reasons why that is. So despite stereotypes that educated people are less religious, what we actually see when it comes to religious membership is that people with a college degree are more likely to be members of a church or place of worship than people without a college degree. And what's happened, I think, as churches and places of worship have become less an important source of social connection is that it has shifted. So other places have kind of picked up the slack. In a poll we conducted last year, we asked people, well, where was the place that you met a close friend? And among Americans overall, the workplace was by far the most important and consistent place people were meeting friends. And that makes a lot of sense. If people are going away to college and then moving to a new city, maybe not knowing anyone, the workplace becomes kind of the hub of their social life. The place they make social connections, the place that they sort of learn and sort of extend their social network outward. And again, we see this difference between college grads and those without a college degree. School and workplace are really important for college grads. Work is still important for the non-college folks, but for both groups, only about 1 in 5 said that they met a close friend at their church or place of worship. And it's even among those who attend regularly, not many said that they've made a close friend at those locations. One of the other things that really distinguishes the college grad group from those without is the extent to which they take advantage of sort of commercial spaces as ways to connect. So whether it's sort of sports clubs or gyms, yoga studios, those kind of places, the college educated group are much more likely to make those kinds of connections or social connections in those types of places than those without a college degree. I mentioned this previously. Again, it's just another example of the way in which religion is sort of moving back and is sort of less central in a lot of sort of important ceremonies and rituals in our personal lives. This is just, we asked, how did you get married? Like, what was the service? Was it a religious setting administered by a religious leader, a non-religious setting, or is it a secular service? And among recent weddings, the majority were basically secular services. And so that is something that is distinct from the recent past. Most of people who were married before 1982 were married in a place of worship officiated by a religious leader. This is just an example. There's any number of sources that show the importance of a variety of like pro-social, civic, and social outcomes that are correlated with religious attendance. Here we just looked at volunteering. And again, people who regularly attend religious services have much higher rates of volunteering than those who don't. Again, it's a pattern that we see replicated in a lot of other data. I just wanted to throw it up so people have an idea of the magnitude of these relationships. I'm running out of time. One thing to note here too, we talk about diversity, is that we don't see a lot of diversity in terms of racial and ethnic diversity in places of worship, particularly among white and Black Americans. They're much more likely to attend places of worship or churches that are predominantly or dominated by their own race or ethnicity. Okay, I'm gonna talk quickly about politicized religion here. Apologies for the speed at which I'm gonna have to go through some of this stuff, but I just wanna make sure we cover some of it. One of, I think, the most important trends when it comes to religion and politics is the politicization of religion. And we're seeing this particularly among evangelical Christians. This is a question that we asked in both 2011 and 2016. And we asked to what extent people believe that if an elected official commits an immoral act in their personal life, can they still behave ethically and fulfill their public duties? And you can see in 2011, what evangelicals were among the least likely to agree with that statement. And then in 2016, after Trump wins the Republican nomination, white evangelicals had a really significant change of heart and shifted dramatically on that same question. And I think one of the things to remember here is that, I think a lot of pundits and political observers like to locate a lot of change and sort of say, Trump was the reason this happened. When it comes to the politicization of religion, this pattern all predated Trump. So there's a growing political divide among religious and non-religious people that goes back to the 90s, really, when we first sort of saw this uptick. So the unaffiliated group and when you look at liberals and conservatives, we're about equally likely to be unaffiliated. Now liberals are sort of dominant. Nearly half of people who are unaffiliated are liberal compared to about like 15% are conservative. This just shows the strong correlation between ideology and religiosity. For people who are unaffiliated in 2018, the most liberal people are also the least religious. The same pattern was not true in the late 80s. Here I want to pause quickly. I know I'm running out of time, but one of the things that's really interesting is that it's not just a division between religious and non-religious, so I think that's an increasingly important sort of source of tension moving forward when it comes to sort of cultural and social views and politics as well. We're also seeing a pretty significant difference, especially in issues of immigration, between people who are white Christian and basically everyone else. So on this question, we asked whether you would describe America as a country with an essential American culture and values that immigrants take on when they arrive, or a country made up of many cultures and values that change as new people arrive. And again, a majority of white evangelicals, white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics all affirm this idea that there's an essential American culture, whereas the majority of Hispanic Catholics, Black Protestants, non-Christians, which we had to sort of collapse to size limitations, but includes Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others, they all line up on the other side. I have to wrap up. If you are interested in this stuff, feel free to get in touch. But the last thing I want to leave you on is the idea of diversity in our personal lives. And some of the work that we focused on over the last year or so is trying to understand how people are engaged in community life and how that influences a whole variety of behavior. And one of the things that we found is that for people for whom are active in their community, so they are out at restaurants or bars or coffee shops regularly in their community, they are far more likely to have more diversity in their social network. So this is something that a lot of sociologists looked at and is called third places. So places in your community that you spend time, not at your home, not at your work. But it could be a public park, it could be a library, any of those kinds of places. And this slide just shows that, if we want to encourage people to be among people, to engage with people who are different from themselves, whether it's race or religion or politics, finding places for them to do so is increasingly important, because so much of the other institutions that are part of our culture, whether it's higher ed, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, are already fairly segregated along those lines. And so I think one of the keys for me is finding spaces where people can be among people who are just different than themselves, and sort of forge those connections. So I apologize that I had to rush through that. I'm already at time. But again, welcome any sort of offline engagement, and definitely please follow our stuff, check us out, the Survey Center on American Life. Thank you.